Have you been asked to calculate the missing amounts for a chart similar to this one and you're not quite sure what to do? Well, you've come to the right place because I'm Professor Capko and I'm going to show you how easy it is to complete this chart in today's video. But first, I want to say I believe something wonderful is about to happen for you, so be on the lookout for it. And now, back to the video. In this problem, we're going to be using the concept of contribution margin to calculate missing amounts. We're given in some cases the units sold, in some cases we're given the selling price, in some cases we're given the variable cost per unit, in some cases we're given the contribution margin. If you're not sure what contribution margin is, I've done some videos on that and I've got one of them linked up here. That might be a good starting spot if you are not sure of what that means. We also are given a certain amount of fixed costs and we're asked to calculate the operating income in some cases, or in other cases the loss. The loss is going to be reflected in parentheses like that to show a negative number, as is the standard in accounting. Let's dive into this. In this one, we know firm A has sold 10,900 units. The selling price, and this is a per unit selling price, $25 per unit. We do not know what the variable cost per unit is. This sometimes might be called variable expense per unit. I'm just going to call it a variable cost per unit. We're given the contribution margin is $112,600. We are told that our fixed costs are $40,500 and our operating income is what we need to find, if it's an operating income or an operating loss. This is a good place to start because we've got the contribution margin and we have the fixed costs. If we take the contribution margin and we subtract from it the fixed costs, that's going to give us our operating income. So I've got 112,600 and I'm going to subtract from it the $40,500 is the fixed cost. And that's going to give us our answer here. I'm going to use a BA2 Plus calculator. It's a calculator that I like to use for accounting and finance. If you want to get one of these for yourself, I've got a link down in the description below, and there's one on the screen as well. So pick it up. It's a nice, simple to use calculator, and I do have videos on how to use it for various items. So check that out in my channel. All right, I'm going to enter the 112,600 and we're going to subtract from that the $40,500, and that's going to give us an operating income, because it's a positive number, of $72,100. So we've got the first part done. The next part we have to calculate is what is the variable cost per unit. We know that the contribution margin overall, and this is a total number, is 112,600. We know that the units sold is 10,900. Let's first find out how much the contribution margin per unit is. So I'm going to take the 112,600 and let's divide that number by the 10,900 units. So in other words, this is the contribution margin overall. Let's find out the per unit contribution margin by dividing it by the number of units sold. There's more than one way to go about this, but I think this might be the easiest way in this case. So I have $112,600 is my contribution margin overall, the aggregate. In other words, once all the units are sold. And we know we sold 10,900, so I divide by 10,900. So that gives us a contribution margin per unit contribution margin of $10.33. So in other words, each unit sold contributes toward your profit $10.33. Since we have a selling price we know is $25, to find the variable cost per unit, I need to subtract out the contribution margin, then that's going to give us out the variable costs. So if I start with $25 per unit as a selling price and I subtract from it the contribution margin, in other words, how much goes toward profit, the $10.33. And the easier way to do this, I already got the 10.33 on the screen, so I'm going to change this to a negative number, and I'm going to add the $25 cost, and that gives me $14.67. And that is our variable cost per unit, $14.67. So in other words, for each of these units, the $25 selling price, $14.67 is the amount it costs to produce each unit. The unit then contributes $10.33 toward the operating income. You multiply that out by the number of units sold. That gives us a total contribution margin. And then we subtract from it our fixed costs, which they're fixed, so it does not matter how many units we sell. And that gives us our operating income. So that is how we calculate it for firm A. Next, for firm B, we're told the number of units sold. We don't know the selling price. We do know the variable cost per unit. We don't know the contribution margin. We do know the amount of fixed costs, and we do know the operating income. Let's start out by figuring out the contribution margin. Likewise, over here, since we did the contribution margin minus fixed costs gives the operating income, it stands to reason that if we start with the operating income and if we add back in the fixed costs, that will give us the contribution margin. Let me demonstrate that here to make it easier. So we have contribution margin, and if we subtract out the fixed costs, that gives us an operating income. Well, in this case, we don't know the contribution margin, so we want to find it. So if I add the fixed cost to both sides, then I wind up with, algebraically, the contribution margin is equal to the operating income plus the fixed costs. That's what I'm talking about here. So if we have the $33,150 of operating income, and I add to that the fixed cost of $63,300, that gives us a total contribution margin of $96,450. See how we got that? Thank you for the thumbs up. That really helps with the channel. Now, let's figure out what our contribution margin, again, back to the same thing, per unit is. We know it's $96,450 overall in the aggregate, but we sold 7,700 units. So if we divide that number by the 7,700, that's going to give us the contribution margin per unit, and that's $12.53. So $12.53 of each unit sold goes toward profit. We still need to figure out how much the selling price is, though. And we know that the selling price minus the variable cost per unit is equal to our contribution margin per unit. We're going to work backward, and I'm going to, once again, because our selling price, if I do this algebraically, the selling price minus the variable cost is equal to the contribution margin. I'm going to work backwards to find the selling price. I'm going to add the variable cost to the contribution margin per unit to find the selling price. So selling price is equal to the variable cost per unit plus the contribution margin per unit. And that's how I wind up with this. So I have $12.53 is our contribution margin per unit. I'm going to add to that the $16 variable cost, and that gives me a selling price of $28.53. And now we've calculated everything we need for our firm B. Let's move on to firm C. In this case, we don't know how many units are sold. We do know the selling price, we do know the variable cost per unit, and we do know the contribution margin. So we should be able to find this out. We don't know the fixed costs, but we do know the operating income. In this case, it's in parentheses, so that tells us it's an operating loss. That is foreshadowing that our fixed costs are going to be higher than our contribution margin. That's how you'd wind up with it. You take the contribution margin, you subtract the fixed costs, and that gives us operating income. Let's find this fixed cost first. Since we have operating income is negative, let's use our formula here again. We know the contribution margin minus the fixed cost is equal to the operating income. And we're trying to find, in this case, we want to find the amount of the fixed costs, right? So either way I can do it. I can add fixed costs to both sides. And that gives us contribution margin is equal to operating income plus fixed costs. And then if I subtract operating income from both sides, that's going to give us fixed costs are equal to the contribution margin minus the operating income. So that's how I'm going to find the fixed cost. Let's fill this in. So our contribution margin in this case is $9,600. And I'm going to subtract from that our operating income. If I'm subtracting a negative, that's the same thing as adding, right? If subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding. So to that, I'm going to add $6,850. And that gives me $16,450. You can check this work by working backward. If I have 9,600 in contribution margin and I subtract out fixed cost of 16,450, that gives me negative $685, which is the amount of the operating loss. So we can determine that that is correct. If we're trying to find now the number of units sold, well, we know that the selling price minus the variable cost per unit times the number of units sold would give us the contribution margin overall. So I'm going to take the selling price of $7.20 and I'm going to subtract from it the variable cost per unit, $4.20. So it's out $7.20 minus $4.20 gives us a $3 per unit contribution margin. So in other words, $3 of each unit goes toward this contribution margin. And all we need to do then to find the total number is divide the 9,600 by the $3. So I have 9,600 divided by $3 is 3,200. So we have 3,200 units sold. 3,200 units sold times $3 gives us a contribution margin of 9,600. I just worked in reverse. Hopefully that made sense. And for the last one, let's do the same thing. We know the contribution margin, we know the fixed costs, we don't know the operating loss or income. In this case, we know the contribution margin is less than the fixed cost, so we expect that this is going to be a negative number. It's a simple matter of subtraction. We have $41,720. We're going to subtract from it $50,750, and that gives us a net loss of $9,030. $9,030 is our net loss. The only other thing we need to figure out then is our selling price. And our selling price we can figure out by taking our contribution margin and dividing it by the number of units sold to find out how much per unit is contributing toward that profit, or in this case loss. So we have 41,720. I'm going to divide it by the 4080, and that tells us that $10.23 is the contribution margin per unit. I take that amount and I
I add that to the variable cost per unit, which is $51, and that gives me $61.23 is the selling price. That is all I have for you today. I hope that made sense for you. If you would like to see more videos like this, put it down in the comments. I would love to have you join this channel as a member. Members get higher priority in getting their questions answered. They also get early access to videos as well as special member only videos. If not that, you have no idea all the benefits you might get if you hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss a video. Let's make it an awesome day. Thank you.